The day we buried my grandmother, it rained. Not the gentle spring shower she would have loved, but a heavy downpour that turned the cemetery grounds into a muddy mess. Looking back, it was fitting. Nature itself seemed to be protesting what my family was about to do. I'm Rachel Morgan, and until 6 months ago, I thought I knew everything about my grandmother, Elizabeth Pierce. She raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 8, filling our days with garden parties, afternoon teas, and stories about the old Victorian mansion we called home. But as I stood there watching them lower her casket into the ground, I realized how much she had kept hidden. "Such a shame about the will," Aunt Patricia said, sidling up to me under her massive black umbrella. Who would have thought Lizzie would be so careless as to not leave one? I frowned, water dripping down my neck despite my own umbrella. "What do you mean?" Grandma was the most organized person I knew. She had a file for everything. "While we've searched everywhere," Uncle Robert chimed in, appearing on my other side. "The lawyer's been through all her papers. Nothing." Something felt wrong about their synchronized appearance, their practiced concern. Grandma Elizabeth had spent the last 30 years of her life meticulously documenting everything, from her prized rose garden varieties to the maintenance history of every antique in the house. The idea that she'd neglect something as important as her will seemed impossible. But grief does strange things to your mind. When Aunt Patricia pressed a stack of papers into my hands later that day, explaining they were just standard forms to help settle the estate, I signed without reading them carefully. After all, they were family. They'd known my grandmother longer than I had. Why would they lie? The answer to that question would shake our family to its core. I spent the next week wandering through the mansion, touching the familiar wallpaper, breathing in a lingering scent of Grandma's favorite lavender sachets. Each room held memories. The library where she taught me to play chess, the conservatory where she nurtured her orchids, the kitchen where she shared her secret recipe for orange cranberry scones. "You should think about selling," Aunt Patricia suggested during one of her increasingly frequent visits. "This place is too big for one person. The maintenance alone." "I'm not selling," I said firmly. "This is home." She exchanged looks with Uncle Robert. "Darling, you don't really have a choice. The estate needs to be settled. Without a will, everything has to be divided equally among the heirs." "What about the papers I signed?" "Just standard release forms," Uncle Robert said smoothly, "to help streamline the process." I didn't believe them, but I was too overwhelmed with grief to argue. Instead, I threw myself into organizing Grandma's belongings. She left everything exactly as it had been during her life. Even her reading glasses still sat on her bedside table, next to a well-worn copy of Pride and Prejudice. The portrait hung above the fireplace in her bedroom, a stunning oil painting of Elizabeth Pierce in her prime, painted the year she'd bought the mansion. I'd grown up looking at that portrait, admiring the strength in her posture, the hint of mischief in her eyes. "Your grandmother was quite a woman," Mr. Chen, the elderly frame maker, had told me once. "She knew exactly what she wanted and exactly how to get it." I was dusting a portrait when I noticed it, a slight gap between the frame and the wall, barely visible unless you were standing on a chair right next to it. My hands trembled as I carefully lifted the heavy frame away from the wall. There it was, a wall safe, hidden behind the portrait all these years. "What did you do with Grandma's jewelry box?" I called out to Aunt Patricia, who was downstairs cataloging silverware. The small wooden one with the mother-of-pearl inlay. "Donated to the church sale," she called back. "Just costume pieces, nothing valuable." But I remembered differently. Inside that box had been a small key on a purple ribbon. Grandma would take it out sometimes, polish it with a soft cloth, then return it to its hiding place. "Sometimes, Rachel," she'd say, "the most valuable things are the ones we keep closest to our hearts." I'd rescue the box from the donation pile without my aunt noticing, unable to part with this piece of my grandmother. Now, holding that key, I understood. It wasn't for jewelry at all. The safe opened with a soft click. Inside, I found several envelopes, a leather-bound journal, and a USB drive that looked surprisingly new. But it was the document on top that made my blood run cold. Grandma's will, dated just 3 months before her death, with final VRSI1 written in her elegant handwriting across the top. I began to read, and with each paragraph, the true scope of my family's deception became clear. The mansion wasn't just a house. It was the tip of an iceberg of family secrets that had been buried for decades. The journal entries went back to 1985, documenting everything. The proof of what really happened to my parents' estate after their death. The truth about the family business that had mysteriously failed the same year. And most importantly, evidence of what my aunt and uncle had been doing with the family trust fund all these years. My hands shook as I read the final entry, dated just days before Grandma died. My dearest Rachel, if you're reading this, then they've done exactly what I feared they would. Patricia and Robert have been waiting years for this moment, thinking I was too old, too trusting to see through their schemes. But I've watched them take advantage of others in our family, watched them manipulate and deceive. They won't stop until they have everything, unless someone stands up to them. I've gathered everything you'll need to expose their lies. The choice of what to do with it is yours. Choose wisely, my darling girl. And remember, sometimes justice wears a velvet glove. The sound of footsteps on the stairs snapped me back to reality. I quickly replaced the portrait, slipping the contents of the safe into my bag just as Aunt Patricia appeared in the doorway. Rachel, the real estate agent is here to discuss listing the property. I turned to face her, Grandma's final words echoing in my mind. Actually, Aunt Patricia, I think we need to have a family meeting. There's something everyone needs to see. The look that flashed across her face told me everything I needed to know. The game was about to change, and for the first time, I held all the cards. The family meeting was set for Sunday afternoon. I spent the intervening days preparing, reviewing every document from the safe, every entry in Grandma's journal. The story they told was devastating. A decades-long web of manipulation and theft that had slowly stripped away our family's legacy piece by piece. They arrived exactly at 3, filing into the formal living room like actors taking their places on stage. Aunt Patricia and Uncle Robert, of course, along with their children, my cousins James and Maria. Uncle David, my grandmother's youngest brother, who lost his share of the family business in what he'd been told was a market downturn. Even Great Aunt Sophie, now in her 80s, who'd been convinced to sign over her inheritance to protect it from taxes. I'd arranged everything carefully, just as Grandma would have. Fine bone china teacups on silver trays. Delicate finger sandwiches arranged on tiered stands. The portrait of Elizabeth Pierce looking down on us all. Her knowing smile now holding new meaning. Thank you all for coming, I began, standing before the fireplace. I've discovered something that changes everything we thought we knew about Grandma's estate. Now, Rachel, Aunt Patricia interrupted, her voice honey-sweet but her eyes sharp. We've been through all this. There's no will, and those papers you signed. You mean these papers? I held up the documents she'd had me sign at the funeral. The ones that supposedly gave up my rights to the estate. Interesting how they're dated 3 months before Grandma died. The room went silent. Uncle Robert's face flushed dark red. But that's impossible, he sputtered. You signed them after you backdated them? I smiled, channeling Grandma's quiet strength. Yes, I did. Just like you had Uncle David sign papers giving up his share of Pierce Industries while he was still grieving Aunt Helen. Just like you convinced Great Aunt Sophie to transfer her trust fund to your special investment account that somehow never generated any returns. I began laying out documents on the antique coffee table, bank statements, transfer records, the real will. With each piece of evidence, the color drained further from my aunt and uncle's faces. How did you? Aunt Patricia whispered. The safe behind Grandma's portrait, she knew what you were planning. She kept records of everything, including what really happened to my parents' estate after their accident. Uncle David leaned forward, his hands shaking. What do you mean? What really happened? I picked up Grandma's journal, opening to a marked page. December 15, 1994. Today, Patricia and Robert presented the paperwork for Michael and Sarah's estate. They claimed the accident voided the life insurance, that the house had to be sold to cover debts. All lies. I found the real insurance payout records, the property deeds they transferred to their own names. But I can't confront them yet, not while Rachel is so young, so vulnerable. They'd find a way to take her too. Great Aunt Sophie began to cry softly. James and Maria looked shell-shocked, learning for the first time what their parents really were. I continued, my voice steady. Grandma protected me the only way she could, by raising me herself, by preparing me for this moment. Everything is documented here. The real will leaves the mansion to me, along with control of the family trust. Uncle David and Great Aunt Sophie's assets are to be restored. And there's a USB drive with copies of everything, already sent to the family lawyer and the district attorney. You wouldn't, Uncle Robert growled. We're family. Family? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Was it family when you stole my parents' insurance money? When you systematically robbed everyone in this room? When you tried to steal my home? We can make a deal, Aunt Patricia said quickly. Whatever you want. Name your price. I walked to the portrait, touching its frame gently. Grandma knew you try that too. She wrote about it in her final entry. Would you like to hear it? Without waiting for a response, I read aloud. They'll offer money, Rachel. They'll appeal to family loyalty. They'll try to make you doubt yourself. But remember, true wealth isn't in bank accounts or property deeds. It's in the strength to stand up for what's right, to protect those who can't protect themselves. I couldn't do it in my lifetime without putting you at risk, but I've given you everything you need to make things right. I turned to face my family, the victims and the perpetrators, all watching me with varying degrees of shock, grief, and dawning understanding. Here's what's going to happen, I said, channeling every lesson in quiet authority Grandma had taught me. First, you're going to sign these papers returning Uncle David and Great Aunt Sophie's assets to them. Then you're going to provide a full accounting of every penny you've stolen over the years. The family lawyer will oversee the restoration of funds. And if we refuse, Uncle Robert's voice was dangerous, desperate. Then I turn everything over to the district attorney. Every document, every transaction, every fraud you've committed. How many years do you think that adds up to, Uncle Robert? How do you think your country club friends will react when they see your names in the headlines? Maria stood up suddenly. I'll help, she said, not looking at her parents. I'm an accountant. I can go through the records, track everything. James nodded, joining his sister. Me too. This has to stop. Aunt Patricia collapsed onto the sofa, her perfect facade finally cracking. Uncle Robert looked like he aged 10 years in the last hour. You have 24 hours to decide, I said. Choose wisely. They chose to cooperate, of course. Self-preservation was always their strongest instinct. Over the next 6 months, Maria and James helped unravel decades of financial manipulation. Uncle David got his company shares back. Great Aunt Sophie's trust fund was restored. Other victims we hadn't even known about came forward as the truth emerged. Aunt Patricia and Uncle Robert left town quietly, their reputation in shambles despite my decision to handle things privately rather than involve the authorities. Last I heard, they'd moved to Florida, living modestly on what little they'd legally earned over the years. The mansion slowly came back to life. I hired back the old gardener they'd fired, and the rose garden began to bloom again. Uncle David's daughter, Jenny, started working with me to restore the family business to what it had once been. A company built on integrity and fair dealing. Great Aunt Sophie moved into the East Wing, filling the halls with her stories of the family's better days. Your grandmother would be so proud, she told me over tea in the conservatory. You're just like her, steel wrapped in silk. I found more of Grandma's notes as we renovated. Little messages tucked away in books or hidden in desk drawers. Life lessons, family history, words of encouragement as if she knew I'd need them. My favorite was behind a loose brick in the garden wall. Remember, darling, a garden grows best when you pull up the weeds completely. Don't leave their roots to poison the soil. Last week, I hosted my first garden party just like Grandma used to. The roses were in full bloom, the lawn perfect, the silver tea service gleaming in the afternoon sun. James and Maria came, bringing their children. Uncle David and Jenny were there, along with Great Aunt Sophie holding court from her favorite wicker chair. Looking around at what remained of our family, smaller now, but stronger, more honest, I felt Grandma's presence, not in a grief of loss, but in the triumph of truth. The portrait still hangs above the fireplace, but I don't need the safe behind it anymore. Its contents have done their work, clearing out the rot that had threatened to destroy everything she'd built. Sometimes in the evening, I sit in her study, surrounded by the books she loved, the photographs she treasured, and I read her journal entries from happier times. A legacy, she wrote, is not in the things we leave behind, but in the truths we pass on. Some battles can't be fought in the open. Sometimes we must wait, prepare, and trust that those we love will be strong enough to finish what we start. She was right, of course. She usually was. The mansion stands prouder now, its shadows cleaned out, its foundations stronger. And somewhere, I like to think, Elizabeth Pierce is smiling that knowing smile, satisfied that justice, even delayed, has finally been served. As for me, I've learned that family isn't just about blood or inheritance. It's about truth, about standing up for what's right, about protecting the vulnerable and exposing the corrupt. Sometimes the greatest act of love is having the courage to break what's broken, so it can be rebuilt into something true. The rain has finally stopped and the garden is growing again, free from weeds, rich with possibilities, just as Grandma always intended.